I never thought I'd end up in a psych ward, but after weeks of unrelenting panic attacks, I hit a breaking point. The kind of breaking point where I couldn't even get off the bathroom floor without shaking. My mom had found me that way, pale and gasping, and she didn't ask questions. She just took me to the ER. The doctor recommended a 72-hour observation. To stabilize you, he said, to help figure out the right treatment. I didn't have the energy to argue. I just nodded. The psych ward wasn't as bad as I imagined. Neutral beige walls, fluorescent lights, and nurses who were brisk but not unfriendly. I was assigned a shared room, which they said would help me feel less isolated. That's when I met Chris. He arrived in the evening, escorted by a nurse. He was tall, almost skeletal, with greasy black hair that fell into his eyes. His clothes hung off him like they didn't quite belong to him. "This is Chris, your roommate," the nurse said. Chris didn't acknowledge her or me. He shuffled to the other bed, dragging a plastic bag of his belongings, and sat down. His hands twitched slightly, his fingers moving as if plucking invisible strings. "Hey," I said, forcing a smile. "I'm Daniel." Chris turned his head, just enough for me to catch his hollow, piercing eyes. "It doesn't matter," he muttered. I wasn't sure if he meant my name or something else. Either way, I decided not to push. That first night, I barely slept. The mattress was thin, and the sounds of the ward seeped into the room. Footsteps in the hall, the hum of the air vents, and the occasional distant shout from another patient. Chris lay on his bed, staring at the ceiling. I thought he might fall asleep eventually, but then I heard it, soft whispers. I couldn't make out what he was saying, but his tone was steady, almost rhythmic. "Are you okay?" I asked, my voice trembling slightly. He didn't respond. His whispering stopped abruptly, and the silence was even worse. After what felt like an eternity, he rolled onto his side, facing the wall. I turned over and stared at the dark ceiling, willing myself to sleep. The next day, I tried to focus on my treatment. The nurses encouraged me to join group therapy, where other patients shared their struggles with anxiety, depression, and trauma. It was supposed to be therapeutic, but I felt more like I was observing than participating. Chris didn't join the sessions. He stayed in the room most of the day, sitting cross-legged on the floor or staring at the wall. Once I saw him crouched by the window, his fingers tracing patterns on the glass. "What are you doing?" I asked, trying to sound casual. He didn't look at me. "They're watching," he murmured. I felt a shiver crawl up my spine. "Who's watching?" He finally turned, his hollow eyes locking onto mine. "You'll find out." I didn't ask any more questions. That night was the worst. I woke up suddenly, disoriented, with a strange feeling that something was wrong. The room was dark except for the faint glow of the hallway light spilling in through the crack under the door. I opened my eyes and froze. Chris's face was inches from mine, hovering above me like a shadow. His pale skin seemed to almost glow in the dim light, and his wide, unblinking eyes stared straight into mine. For a moment, I couldn't move. My chest tightened, and my breath caught in my throat. "Chris?" I managed to whisper, my voice shaking. He tilted his head slightly, like a bird studying its prey. "You look peaceful when you sleep," he said softly. I jerked back, pressing myself against the wall. "What the hell are you doing?" He didn't move. He just stood there, his hands hanging limply at his sides, his gaze still fixed on me. "Sometimes they come when you sleep," he said. I was making sure they didn't. "What are you talking about? Who comes?" Chris didn't answer. Instead, he stepped back, his movements slow and deliberate, and sat on the edge of his bed. He stayed there, staring at the floor, until I finally worked up the courage to turn on the light. The rest of the night, I didn't close my eyes. Every time Chris shifted, every time he so much as breathed, my heart raced. By the time morning came, I was counting the minutes until I could leave. The nurses said I was responding well to the medication, and that I seemed calmer. But they didn't know about Chris. They didn't know about the way his presence made my skin crawl, or how his eyes seemed to bore into me, even when I wasn't looking. Chris barely moved that day. He sat in the corner of the room, whispering to himself and occasionally laughing under his breath. When my mom arrived to pick me up, I packed my things quickly, eager to get out of that room. Before I left, I hesitated. I wasn't sure why, but I turned to Chris one last time. "Take care of yourself," I said, though the words felt hollow. Chris looked up at me, and for the first time he smiled. It wasn't a friendly smile. It was slow, deliberate, and far too wide. "You'll be back," he said. The words sent a chill down my spine. I didn't say anything else. I just walked out of the room, down the hall, and into the lobby where my mom was waiting. As we drove away, I couldn't stop thinking about Chris. His voice, his smile, the way he'd watched me while I slept, it was all burned into my mind. I knew I'd never forget him, no matter how much I wanted to. Back when I worked at Maple Ridge Psychiatric Facility, we dealt with our fair share of challenging patients. But one particular day turned into a nightmare none of us could have anticipated. Among our patients was a man I'll call Mark, someone with a history of violence and unpredictable behavior. Mark had been admitted after a violent altercation with his family, and while we were trained professionals, his presence kept everyone on edge. It was a stormy afternoon, rain pounding against the facility's windows, when everything changed. Mark had been unusually quiet that day, sitting alone in the lounge area. He stared out the window, his expression distant, as though he were lost in some internal storm of his own. The stillness seemed like a welcome reprieve from his usual volatility, so none of us questioned it, until one of the nurses, Emily, entered the room to check on him. What happened next unfolded in seconds but felt like slow motion. As Emily approached, Mark sprang to his feet, his eyes wild with desperation. Before anyone could react, he grabbed Emily by the arm, yanking her close. His strength was astonishing, and the panic in Emily's eyes was unmistakable as she tried to pull free. The rest of us rushed toward them, but Mark reached into the pocket of his hospital-issued sweater and pulled out a jagged piece of glass, likely scavenged from a broken window or mirror. He held it tightly, waving it threateningly. "Stay back," he shouted, his voice trembling with a mix of fear and anger. "I'll do it." The room froze. None of us wanted to provoke him further, but the sight of that glass shard in his hand, so close to Emily, sent a chill through us. We were in a hostage situation, a scenario none of us had ever expected to face inside the supposedly secure walls of a psychiatric facility. I called for the hospital's security team, but I knew it would take them time to arrive. Meanwhile, Emily's safety depended on keeping Mark calm and contained. I took a deep breath and stepped forward, raising my hands to show I meant no harm. "Mark," I said as steadily as I could manage, "we don't want anyone to get hurt. Let's talk this out." His eyes darted around the room, frantic and mistrustful. For a moment, it seemed as though he might consider my words, but then his face hardened. "You don't understand anything," he yelled, his grip on Emily tightening as she winced in pain. "You're right," I replied, trying to keep my voice level. "I don't understand everything you've been through, but I want to. You're not alone in this, Mark. We can figure it out together. Just let Emily go." Tension in the room was unbearable. Every second felt like an hour as I tried to connect with him, to bridge the gap between his fear and our attempts to help. Emily, to her credit, remained as calm as anyone could in such a terrifying situation. When Mark's grip on her arm loosened slightly, she seized the opportunity to speak. "Mark," she said softly, "I know you're in pain. I know it feels like no one can understand, but that's not true. I've seen people come back from some of the darkest places, and I believe you can too." Her words seemed to reach him in a way that mine hadn't. His breathing slowed, and the hand holding the glass began to tremble. "You don't know what it's like," he muttered, his voice cracking. "No one does." "You're right," Emily replied gently. "I don't know exactly what you've been through, but I do know what it's like to feel lost, and I know there's a way back." Over the next agonizing hour, we continued to talk Mark down. He began to open up, revealing the depth of his struggles, years of untreated depression, paralyzing anxiety, and a crushing sense of isolation. The incident that had led to his admission was just the breaking point of a lifetime of bottled-up pain. As Mark spoke, his grip on Emily's arm loosened further until finally he let her go. The glass shard fell from his hand as he sank to his knees, sobbing. Relief flooded the room as the security team arrived and safely restrained him, ensuring he couldn't hurt himself or anyone else. Emily, though shaken, was unharmed. Mark, however, was immediately placed under close supervision. It was clear he needed more intensive treatment than he'd been receiving, and arrangements were made for a more specialized care plan. The events of that day were a stark reminder of the complexities of mental health. Mark's actions were dangerous, but they stemmed from a place of deep pain and desperation. It would be a long road to recovery for him, but that day became a turning point, a moment when he finally began to receive the help he so desperately needed. For those of us who witnessed it, the experience left an indelible mark. It underscored the importance of empathy and the critical need for proper mental health care. Even in the face of danger, understanding and connection can be powerful tools for healing. That stormy afternoon at Maple Ridge wasn't just a terrifying ordeal. It was also a moment of hope, fragile but real, for a man who had been lost for far too long. Working in a psychiatric ward, you get used to the unexpected. Patients have their outbursts, staff gets pushed to their limits, and every day feels like a test of your patience and nerves. But one incident still haunts me, an ordinary shift that turned into a nightmare. It all started with something small. A kitchen knife went missing. It was my night shift, and the ward was unusually quiet. Rain pattered against the windows, and the faint hum of fluorescent lights filled the air. I was in the staff room, finishing up some paperwork, when Sam, one of the kitchen staff, burst in, pale and out of breath. "I can't find one of the knives," he said, his voice shaking. At first, I didn't think much of it. Kitchen items sometimes got misplaced. I figured someone had taken it for cleaning or left it in the wrong drawer. But when we checked the kitchen, the tension rose. Every knife was accounted for except one, a large, sharp chef's knife. Sam swore he'd seen it earlier during dinner prep. We searched everywhere, counters, sinks, storage, even the trash. Nothing. That's when the reality sank in. In a psych ward, a missing knife isn't just an inconvenience, it's a threat. I notified the charge nurse, and within minutes, the staff was on high alert. A patient could have taken it. That thought sent a chill down my spine. We couldn't risk causing panic, so we started quietly checking patient rooms. I remember stepping into the first room, my heart pounding. Most of the patients were already asleep, their breathing slow and steady, but the thought that someone might be hiding the knife, waiting for the right moment, made my stomach twist. "Any luck?" I whispered to my coworker, Grace, as we regrouped in the hallway. She shook her head. "Nothing, but I've got a bad feeling about this." The night dragged on as we continued our search. The storm outside grew louder, thunder rumbling through the building. The air felt heavy, like something was about to happen. Around 2 a.m., things got worse. One of the patients, Ellie, started screaming from her room. We ran to her, my pulse racing. "What's wrong?" I asked, my voice barely steady. "They're in here," she cried, pointing to the corner of her room. "They're watching me. They have something sharp." My blood ran cold. The corner she pointed to was empty. Still, her terror felt real, and it only made the situation more unsettling. Was it paranoia, or did she know something we didn't? We calmed her down, but the unease lingered. By now, whispers were spreading among the staff. Someone joked nervously about ghost stories, but no one laughed. The missing knife was no joke. At 3 a.m., during another sweep of the common areas, we found something that made my heart stop. On one of the lounge chairs was a dark smear. Blood. "Is that?" Grace began, but I cut her off. "It's blood," I said. "Fresh." We checked the patients immediately, searching for injuries. No one seemed hurt, but the atmosphere grew even more tense. If no one was bleeding, then where had the blood come from? Around 4 a.m., the generator flickered. For a split second, the lights dimmed, casting the ward into near darkness. The storm outside raged on, wind howling like a living thing. "Do you hear that?" Grace whispered. I strained my ears. At first, I thought it was just the storm, but then I heard it, soft, shuffling footsteps. We followed the sound down the hallway, our flashlight beams cutting through the dark. The footsteps stopped as we reached the door to the laundry room. The door was ajar, creaking slightly as it swayed. I pushed it open, my hands trembling. The room was empty, or so it seemed. But then I noticed a pile of sheets in the corner, haphazardly thrown together. Slowly, I stepped closer. My flashlight caught something glinting among the fabric. The knife. It was streaked with blood. My breath caught in my throat as I backed away, my mind racing. Who had hidden it here? And why? Grace stepped forward to grab it, but before she could, the laundry door slammed shut behind us. We both froze. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice shaking. No answer, but the faint sound of breathing came from just beyond the door. Someone was out there. We stood frozen, our eyes locked on the door, until the sound of keys rattling broke the tension. It was the charge nurse, accompanied by security. They opened the door, but the hallway was empty. Whoever had been there was gone. The knife was secured, and the ward was locked down. We spent the rest of the night trying to piece together what had happened. No patient admitted to taking the knife, and no one could explain the blood. Security footage showed nothing but static during the times we needed it most. To this day, no one knows who took the knife or what they intended to do with it. But I'll never forget the terror of that night, the feeling of being hunted in a place meant to be safe. The missing knife was found, but the questions it left behind still haunt me.